Hey, Rob.
Hi there.
Continue.
Hi there.
See,
How are you?
I've got my handy assistant here, Andy Biddle, who came over to get me on. So if we're on, I'll just hang in there with you until you get ready for the program. I wanted to get on early to make sure I got dessert.
Good call. I was beginning to think that the link was or I'd done something wrong to set it up wrong because I hadn't anybody around.
Well, the only sad part about this is that if people don't know I'm doing the program, they think it's the Wabash volleyball coach. But if I'm announced as a speaker, I usually have that impact on the crowd.
Well, I wondered about that because Gary told me that you were going to be the speaker, and I'm looking at the newsletter and it said it's supposed to be Brian Bowerman.
Yeah.
click up
Well,
here and expand your screen a little bit. Yeah, well, it'd be right there, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm always an expansive speaker. Let me try something. If I hold this up,
Drop it down a little bit.
Here's your camera right here.
what? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, that's good.
Right.
Hold up one of my favorite cartoons, which is a picture of Hoosiers. Part of the talk is going to be about the derivative of the name Hoosiers and
Oh, yeah, who's your? Well, I'll
okay.
go over and watch it at home.
Okay,
as long
well,
as I got
these are my visual aids. You've
Yeah.
seen them all.
So that was going to be my next question is, do you have a PowerPoint presentation?
No, I was going to have Andy hold stuff up like the ring announcer in boxing.
Okay. And
Well,
then-
now, you might feel more comfortable if I'm not sitting there watching it,
Yeah.
so,
Thank you.
yeah, you bet. Got you on then. Okay. I'll see you in a minute.
See you,
I-
Andy.
I was going to also mention to you that I have thought about doing the same presentation for international students over the years. And one thing I learned is finally the way to learn how to do something is to make sure that you make a presentation. You have to get yourself organized. But years ago, a colleague at Wabash, you could, I think, reflect on this, once said to me, there is nothing more dangerous than an uninvited lecture. And so the club is in danger.
I see, is that Byron and Karen joining us from Hawaii? Or are you back in the States?
Well, I'm back in the States.
Well, welcome
Can you
back.
hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Now, what happened to my photo here?
Well, there's a picture of you and your lovely wife standing looks like in a field of saguaro cactus, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was probably a long time ago. That was probably, what's the name of that place down there in Arizona?
Joshua Tree National
Joshua
Forest.
Yeah, Joshua Tree. That's right. But I don't-
If you click on in the lower left corner of your screen, click
Yeah.
on the video thing.
Oh, start video. Okay.
It should, yeah. There you go.
Here we are.
It was covered up. I couldn't see it there.
Okay. When did y'all get back?
We got back yesterday afternoon.
All right.
Kind of experiencing that jet lag a little bit. My hands are still shaking. It's 5 hours difference between here and Hawaii. And my daughter said it takes your body a day for each hour difference.
That's about right.
And when we went over, we experienced just about that much time just to get your body adjusted.
It's always tougher going eastbound.
Well,
When you're going westbound, you're basically chasing the sun, so it just makes for a long day. But when you're coming back the other direction, it really messes up your circadian rhythms.
yeah, I'd have to
Right.
agree with
Try it from Japan sometime. Take
that. Oh,
off
Rich,
at,
oh my
take
gosh,
off at
Jerry.
noon and land at 10:30, an hour and a half before you took off. That'll mess you up for 3 or 4 days at least.
Wow. Are you hearing some background noise? I just got a little bit of time left on the washing machine here.
I don't hear anything.
Oh, okay, good. Otherwise, if it is, I'll mute myself here.
Can I bring some stuff over?
Bring some stuff over.
So it's not done.
Well, sure. So is this it so far, Dave? We've got 5. Oh, here's Carolyn coming on.
So far, yeah.
It's early.
You got me. Gary can't make it because he's doing a meeting for one of the other division clubs.
Yeah.
And Caleb called me about 10 o'clock and said, I just realized I have a team meeting in Indianapolis, so can you run the meeting? So
Wow.
you got me to run the meeting today,
Oh, that's good. You'll do a fine job.
which means we can, since we don't have an agenda, make it up as we go along and we'll be all right. Carolyn, we can see your picture. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, all right.
Can we tell Gary that I won the lottery?
The marble lottery,
Yeah.
a little hard to sell tickets when we're kind of split up like.
That's the good part of it. This is for Shar. Part of the presentation is going to deal with Indians in Wisconsin. So hang in there.
Okay, well, are they gonna be Winnebago or Ho Chunk?
Well, they're going to be a whole bunch.
Okay. Well, I'll put on my headdress and participate.
Part of this is there's so much confusion about what Indians were in Indiana, and a lot of them have been dislocated. I'll steal part of my presentation and driven by the Iroquois up to the Green Bay area. So, for example, the language groups are all mixed up, and in Door County, the peninsula that helps
Right.
Green Bay, they were Winnebago, and they were Sioux-speaking Indians. And the various language groups, but I was surprised to find that some people claim that there were Chippewa Indians in northern Indiana, which there may have been a few after, well, I'll cover that in the presentation, but there was a huge Indian population around Green Bay down the Fox River, all the way over to the Mississippi, of mixed tribes.
Well, I've always been very interested in Native American culture.
Yeah.
When Dick was alive, we went to several states where we went through the history of the Native Americans that had lived there and then been transported further west.
Yeah. Well, I have distant relatives who are Choctaws. A distant relative married into the Choctaw family, and once went to a family reunion where they were talking about things, and one of them said to me, this is in Oklahoma, you know what the Indian name for revenge is for the white man? I said, well, no. He said, it's called a casino.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Hey, Robin, I got a question for you.
Yes.
You studied up on Indians. You know, you've heard of the Winnebago Corporation. They sell the big trailers and stuff.
Yeah.
So is there some background to the original owner or developer of that organization with the Indians?
I have no idea. I really don't know. But I would give you one other thought. One of the constant complaints of Indians is their names and terms have been appropriated, for some of them not very favorable, like the Washington Redskins. So I would doubt that the Winnebago Indians, it has the connotation of you're being up in the north and moving around.
Yeah.
Probably some group of Indians who would like a slice of the money from the Winnebago Corporation for using their names.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are, again, these distant relatives in Oklahoma, and very interestingly they are absolutely clear that they want their high school team named the Warriors or the Chiefs or Indian names that are English that we've applied to them, but they are absolutely adamant that we're not going to change our name because some white man has offended some other group of Indians.
Yeah. Well, I could see that. There's no problem with that, I don't think.
No, I think we've just gotten too politically correct and we're forgetting our heritage and our history and it's all, what can I do right now? What's in the instant? Nothing else matters.
Well, I'm sympathetic to a lot of the things that the Indians object to, and part of this is that there was a lot of culture that was really shared. I mean, the what's called the New Indian history focus is not just more on the poor Indians getting beaten up, but how about the various tribes reacted and reformed. But one other name that is borrowed in Indiana that most people would think about is Anderson, Indiana, is named after an Indian. And so who was Anderson? Well, he was a chief of the Delaware tribe with the Lenape, in their words, who gets forced west. They don't go up north, they get forced west and settle in the area that become Anderson. And he has a Lenape name, but the Delaware had never been there before, but they settled there. But how does he get the name Anderson? His grandfather is one of the Swedish settlers in the small Swedish colony in Delaware. So he is part Swedish. So I think we could, well, here's another thought for you too, that are increasingly a number of people believe that they have identified where the Indians came from, or at least some of them came from in Asia up by Lake Baikal, way up in southern Siberia. And they actually think they have a group that they can identify linguistically, not just genetically, but linguistically for there. So I suggest that if Mr. Putin keeps giving us trouble, we lay claim to northern Siberia on the basis that that's our homeland. Doesn't seem to be striking some of you as
Good luck with that.
humorous as I. But
Sounds like we'd have to go to war to do
try
that.
every other article on Putin, we ought to try argument on Putin, we ought to try that one.
I know a really bad joke about an Indian tribe that I really can't tell.
Well, don't bring it up then.
Your
Well,
team-
I'll tell you in private sometime if you'd like to know.
Well,
Anybody, it's kind of a private joke.
well,
Since this is being recorded,
And will be published on the YouTube channel later
I
on.
deny I ever heard it. A lot of people have gotten into a lot of trouble for.
well, it's not an ethnic joke. It's just a funny joke.
Well, let me use one of my jokes here before we officially started, in the presumption that we're waiting for the crowd to build.
And that's the assumption.
There's the old story about the guy who walks up to the country store and there's this snarling, vicious dog, and there's a guy sort of spitting and whittling sitting there, and the newcomer says to the guy, "Does your dog bite?" The guy says, "No." He takes a step and the dog attacks him viciously. So he beats the dog off. He turns to the guy and he said, "I thought you said your dog didn't bite." He said, "Ain't my dog." First of that,
That's good.
First of that is how the Europeans, English, and Americans particularly bought land from the Indians. They talked to some Indian and said, "You're the chief, aren't you?" Yeah. Said, "You sell us that land?" He said, "Well, let's bargain." They bargain, and they finally said, "Well, I'll sell you that land." And they make a deal with them, and then other Indians arrive and said, "What are you doing on our land?" And they said, "Well, we just bought it here from your chief." He said, "Ain't our chief."
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I'll bet some of that happened.
it happened all the time because, and part of the story we'll get into is a little bit about Tecumseh, the great Indian chief who does a lot of work in Indiana.
Did you ever see that show, Oh, Peter Sellers was in, what was the name of that? He made 2 or 3 movies.
Pink Panther.
Yes. I think The Return of the Pink Panther, they do that dog joke.
Yeah,
Is that the one?
yeah.
That's not my dog.
Yeah. Yeah. The Pink Panther may not be one of the French's favorite movies in terms of the way it's portrayed.
Those are hilarious. They're really funny.
Well, he made another movie where he acted several parts, Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Anymore, but that was both a funny but irritating movie in many ways and alarming as it was intended to be.
George C. Scott as General Turgidson.
Pardon?
George C. Scott as General Turgidson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Slim Pickens rides the bomb out of
Right, the
Right.
hydrogen bomb at the end, yeah.
Well, one of the
Dark
lines,
humor at its very best.
one of the great lines in there is when one of Sellers' roles is the British air commander who's desperate to make a call to try and stop the war from me, and he needs a dime to get on the telephone. The communications. The other character actor there, I'm forgetting his name, an American, who's an American colonel. He's saying, I need a dime. The guy said, I don't have a dime. He said, well, there's a Coke machine. Shoot it open and get me a dime. I said, well, that's private property. So he finally convinces them to shoot this Coke box open. And the American character actor said, you're going to answer to the Coca-Cola company for this.
Captain Mandrake.
One other thought here for you is some background. How many of you have seen the movie Dances with Wolves?
No.
It's on television sometime, somewhere now. It's on so much, but it's takes part of its roots from what's called the New American History, which tries to see what's happening between the interaction of Indians and whites from the Indian perspective, and doesn't view them as just sort of hapless victims collapsing. Tries to explain how they make decisions and how they are reacting to it. And the American is sort of this just reporter. He's an actor in it. I mean, in the active sense, he provides the weapons for them to defend themselves from the Pawnee, but it's a much more, from some perspectives, realistic view of just hapless Indians or violent Indians for violence sake, to explain how they react and how they form attachments. And so that is, for example, is a movie very different from The Last of the Mohegans, which is perpetually remade and new iterations with new actors.
We'll give it another couple of minutes here. Got Karen trying to join us.
Hey, like this weather, Byron.
Oh, I really don't. Andy, I had to put a pair of long pants on today.
Oh, my God.
No, and this is the honest truth. I was over there 28 days and I never had anything on but shorts the whole time. I went to the airport yesterday. I told Karen, I'm going to wear shorts. And then once we get just ready to board the plane, I'll put my long pants on because it's always cold on the plane, you know.
So you only had shorts on, no shirt.
You're right.
How did you get service in restaurants?
Oh, David, I had a shirt on. I'd scare people off when they saw my body.
Was it a Hawaiian shirt?
Well, yes, I did have some Hawaiian shirts. Yes, a few anyway. They're really. Go ahead.
Were you on Kauai the whole time?
We were on Kauai the whole time. Yeah. Yeah, it's a nice island. They call it a garden island.
Yeah.
It's so green and flowers are blooming. Dave, Polly, you would love it over there, being a biologist like yourself. And we saw there's in the United States, there's 5 botanical research gardens. One in south of Miami there, one on Maui and 3 on Kauai. And we went and visited the 3 on Kauai this time. It's kind of beautiful. They're trying to preserve a lot of trees that are, because of the global warming, they're kind of disappearing. So they take some trees over there and try to nurture them along to keep the species alive.
Well, I've got 12 o'clock, so I'm going to ring the meeting to order. You got me to run things today. Gary has a division meeting, I think, in Carmel. And I got a phone call from Caleb about 10 o'clock saying that he forgot he had a team meeting over in Indianapolis. So he was on his way to Indy and he asked if I could do it. So you got me for the day. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I have our flag here.
Pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag
of the
of the United States of
States of
America
America and
and
to
to the
the
republic
republic
which stands
stands
one nation under God,
one nation under God, and
liberty and justice for
with
all.
liberty, justice for all.
I don't know if we have an indicator today. I don't see one listed. So anybody want to volunteer or we'll just move on?
I can do that.
Okay, Andy, would you please?
We thank you, Father, for this time that we can gather as Kiwanians, and hopefully we can meet together in person here pretty soon. These meetings are good, but we need the interaction personally, I think, for our well-being. We'd ask that you continue to challenge us with opportunities in the community and in the state and the world to further our helping of children. We'd thank you again for all the blessings you've sent us. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Andy. A couple of announcements. Caleb said that the after hours group will meet tonight at 5:30 at the Backstep Brewery. So if any of you are interested in going down for a pint and a little bit of camaraderie with the younger group, why they're going to be there tonight at 5:30. And also on the 26th, which is 2 weeks from this coming Saturday, that's going to be Backstep's 5th anniversary. And they are going to tap the Kiwanis. I think he's got a stout that he's got in the process of brewing. And so they're going to tap that night. I think we ought to try to get a turnout down there for that, help them celebrate their 5th, and make sure that the Kiwanis stout is drinkable. The only other thing that I have is that just a reminder, we are planning Pancake Week again in collaboration with the local McDonald's franchisee. That's going to be the week of March 28th through April 2nd. And Caleb said that they would be sending tickets out fairly soon for us to sell. So keep an eye out for those. I'm assuming you're going to distribute those through mail, but they may be holding off in hopes that we can get back to face-to-face meetings at the library. I think what he said last week was that at least we will be meeting via Zoom this week and on the 17th, and possibly we could get back face-to-face on the final Thursday of this month. Anybody else have any other announcements or comments that they want to make for the good of the order?
I have a question.
What's that?
And for the sake of attendance, who is iPad with the hot air balloons?
Dennis Coons, I believe.
Yes,
Okay,
Dennis.
I saw
thank
his shoulder,
you.
I saw his shoulder in there a minute ago. But I don't know where he went before, but I recognize his background.
There he is.
There he is.
He must be eating his lunch.
Yep, good guess.
Thank you very much.
Happy bucks. Anybody happy about anything? I'd throw in a couple just because I'm happy most of the snow is gone, and I can at least get down my driveway without falling on my backside. Somebody else? Okay, well, I think since we can't do the marble lottery very easily via Zoom, we'll move on, and I will turn it over to our speaker. The newsletter said it was going to be Brian Bowerman, who's the Wabash volleyball coach, but apparently he and Rob have switched places, and so Mr. Pebbleworth is going to tell us about Indians, Indiana, and what was it, Hoosiers?
Yeah, I've shuffled the title around a little bit too, but let me
Okay.
explain if you're ready for me.
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody, and then Rob, you'll need to unmute yourself so that we can hear you. Do you know how to do that? Rob, do you know how to unmute yourself?
Do me?
Yes. Do you know how to unmute
No,
yourself?
I don't. There's a sound symbol up there. Do I just click on it?
There's
Yeah.
the little microphone symbol in the lower left part of the screen. Let me mute you now. Now click on that little microphone and you can unmute yourself. Andy, did you neglect to teach him this? Let me see if I can do it from here.
That wasn't part of our instructions. I can go over there and unmute him if you want me to.
No, I'm going to see if I can do it from here.
Robin, there's a little microphone thing that has a red line through it. Click on it with your mouse. You see it? It should be up there where you clicked when we clicked video. It should say a little thing. It said, there you go. There you go.
Yeah, okay. We ready?
Yes, sir. The
We're ready?
floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I used to tell students that if you ever had a comment or whatever, don't hesitate. If you're muted, that makes it a lot safer for me. I also used to say, please don't hesitate, but don't throw hard objects if you don't like something. But anyway, let me explain about the volleyball coach. I thought it would be a good program because it's a new sport and particularly new when you think about it for college males, and impressed as I watched the Olympics of how good many athletes are in settings I just don't think of that of being that good. And so I asked him to speak, and then they are in an athletic conference that's not our usual conference, and most of the teams that they're playing are in far northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, a few in Chicago. And they've had problems with the schedule bouncing around. So he's got a lot to manage between the weather and COVID and anything else. I thought it'd be better if he was in person, and maybe we'll be in person by the end of the month. But I encourage you to go on the Wabash website, and you can actually watch some of those matches online. I don't know if they got a commentator or not, but if you get tired of watching curling at the Olympics, here is an alternative for you. But I hope you'll be in person, and it'd probably be better with interaction with him with questions. Okay, the title of my thing that I keep shuffling around, and I mentioned earlier to a few people, there's nothing more dangerous than an uninvited lecture, and you're getting it. But I kept thinking during the pandemic about things that, I thought about for a while. So the topic here would be the Indians meet the Hoosiers, a refugee situation. And if there's something in that that would help us to think about the refugees that we now have coming to this country. I'm sure for many of you, and I don't want anything that I'm going to say today be interpreted as anti-refugee. It's far from it. It's that I think we need refugees very, very badly. But there are certain things that come up when you have refugees. And I think if we look at the history, which I hope would be some interest for you anyway, but that we might know something about refugees. One of the things that prompted me to think about this and by the way, the idea that Indians who are in Indiana are refugees is not new. There's a historian named White that talks about the middle ground and goes through this in great elaborate detail about how and why it happened. And on the other hand, there is another historian, David Hackett Fisher, who talks about the people who are from the borderlands of northern Britain. We think about the Scotch-Irish, many of you be familiar with it, but Fisher claims that we really should be talking about the people in the borderlands and that they were refugees when they came to the colonies and were forced more or less to the frontier. So you had these two cultures that clash, and it happens in Indiana. But another thing that prompted me to be interested in this is that I probably have mentioned before that I worked with foreign students at Wabash extensively, and particularly in the 80s when we started getting more Asian students. They would be more interested in Indians, and they arrive in Indiana, which they could hardly find on the map, let alone Crawfordsville. And they would say, some of them during orientation, I'd like to meet the Indians. I said, well, there aren't any Indians in Indiana to speak of anymore. Well, why? Why is it named Indiana if there are no Indians here? Another little piece of oddity in the history in this is Indiana is the only state that was in the Northwest Territory, but this goes beyond that, west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi, that does not have an Indian name. It's named Indiana, the land of the Indians. But if you look at all the other states, Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, they're all Indian names. And until you go to the west, till you hit the Spanish names or the French names. So there was a good deal. Why would you name states for Indians if it's endless conflict, et cetera? And there are lots of other Indian names. But anyway, what I thought might be interesting to talk about, well, one other tidbit here. In the late 1950s, I took a class at IU called The History of the North American Indian up to 1492. It was taught by a female professor, which was really rare in those days, Hermione Wheeler Vogelin. And she was a specialist on where Indians had been at various points in times. And she served on an Indian Claims Commission, and Indian tribes were making claims for compensation that they had been driven out of so-and-so to such and such. But the problem was who was where, when, and what kind of a claim did they have to the land. Anyway, from that, I had some interest, and there were some other connecting points. But let's just start. If we want to say we have refugees now that come because of obscure events far away, let me see if I can start with places that are obscure enough to try and convince you that we are part of the picture, even though we weren't part of the start. If you pick the year 1650, if many of you have thought about that very much, I suspect not, but two series of events start to propel the events that by the 1750s in Indiana, a century later, are beginning to set up the situation in which our picture, most of us, of the conflict of the Midwestern Indians and the settlers is starting. So let's start with the Indians. In 1650, the Iroquois Confederation, which are 5 tribes that are linguistically similar, but are separate to some degree culturally, but have a confederation they put together, finish essentially conquering the Huron. And the Hurons are another Iroquois-speaking group of Indians that live on the north side of Lake Ontario, and the Iroquois live on the south side of the St. Lawrence River, what's northern Pennsylvania, New York up to the Adirondacks. Just a brief moment about what's happening with Indians right now. History, it ain't what it used to be, is a common phrase. And there's what's called the New Indian History, which focuses more on the Indians' ability to adapt in all sorts of ways. And indeed, what we think we know about Indians constantly changes, and it is very hard to say anything specific about Indians. One of the things I remember from that class 60 years ago was the introduction was that if there were two men on the Great Prairies of the West in say 1400 and they walk and they see another guy, they don't say, oh good, there's another Indian. They didn't have the concept of being an Indian. That's something that we imposed upon them and said, you all have something in common. And one of the themes here is how hard it was for the Indians to think about Indianness. But by the way, the white men, and I'll use that phrase, though, that it's not terribly popular because I mean Europeans, but it gets so confused about who was what nationality. And rather than just say Europeans, because we're dealing with Americans later, is that it was very difficult to say who was a Frenchman or who was German or who was Dutch or who was English, let alone British. So the concept used to be that the Indians had walked across a land bridge during an earlier period of weather change. And by the time in 1650, we're in the end of what was called the Little Ice Age. It was much colder. In the American Revolution, the New York Harbor froze over. It was very cold and the climate was different. But the Indians came over and broke up. And so the idea was that they came over about 10,000 years ago. The problem is they kept digging up dates literally that were much earlier than that. And you had to question if the climate was part of it. Maybe they came over the ice or came down the coast. So the conception now is that they came much earlier. But the question then is what Indians are related to each other, and how do we know where they were? Well, you're talking about a slice in time, and I'm going to hold this up just so you could see what it is and be appropriately confused. And what this is a blob. It's hard to distinguish. And that's the point. It's a blob and hard to distinguish. That is a map of the Indian language families. There were probably about 1,000 different languages spoken, many of them now, very small groups, many of them now gone. What's important here, I think, is that we know from the language maps, they can go back, linguists can, and look for common words and trace them way back and see when words start occurring, and they can tell when languages broke up and conversely, when they were one language. And so we're going to deal with a couple of language groups here. The Algonquin Indians, which were the ones that primarily end up in Indiana, and the Iroquois, which are the tribe I talked about. And tribe is a word we use. That's not what they would have used. And then the Sioux language family. Well, we think just to start with, the Sioux are up in the Dakotas. Well, they were, and these language groups are not contiguous. They're broken up into little blobs. So the Sioux language group has also the Catawbas, which were in North Carolina. The Iroquois had a language, Iroquois speaking people who were to the south too, the Cherokee. And there were the Tuscarora, which eventually moved from North Carolina, or the Carolinas, up to the New York area to join the Confederation. And just to give you an example of the movement and the space covered, is that the Comanche, which are thought of as the paramount tribe in the Southwest, are really start with their impoverished group of Ute Indians, come down to the Great Plains, capture horses that have escaped from the Spanish, and become the master of horses and horse warfare, and trade like all the Indians did, traded enormously over long distances. But the Comanche are part of a language group called the Uto-Aztecan group. They're linguistically related to the Aztecs, if you can believe that. And up far in the far north are the Athabascans, who are just south of the Eskimo. They are now thought to be some of the oldest Indian language groups in the country, but they're related to the Navajo and the Apache. So we're going to talk about briefly these language groups and what happens, but the Iroquois by 1650 feel attacked by the Europeans and diseases, but they have already traded with the French and the Dutch and the English to some extent for metal, iron, which is really very useful to them for pots, all that sort of stuff, but weapons, axes where they clear the land. And they very early on adopted European farming instruments, interestingly enough, and they wanted the heavy duty hoes, for example. And they lashed out at neighboring tribes. They were an aggressive, I don't think many people would, nasty, and they're setting up an empire. So they attack the Algonquin speakers, but they also attack other Huron speakers. They end up disliking the French and are opposed to the French and end up allying themselves with the British. But they attack and lash out, and they do that to control the fur trade. There were what called the Beaver Wars. They raided long distance, and one of the keys here is that they were a raiding culture, and they're going to collide with an English raiding culture, the people from the borderlands. And they raid for a variety of reasons that are deeply culturally embedded. They were an agricultural people. They grew corn. This is for Byron. I don't know what seed brand they used, but they grew corn, and they would trade that to the Indians north of them who could not grow crops because of bad land and the brutal winters. So they were used to trading, and they wanted to control that trade, take the furs, get their cut out of them, and trade them on. The colonial powers tried not to sell weapons to the Indians, firearms in particular. They sold a lot of hatchets, but I mean that seriously. It was a big trade item. But Europe was awash in wars, and so they had a huge surplus of junk weapons. Well, it was like foreign aid. We got this military junk we can't use. Let's sell it to somebody as a gesture of friendship. So they sold, the Dutch did. The Dutch wanted to trade. They didn't much want land. The French wanted to trade, but their policy was that they would not sell weapons to non-Christian Indian tribes, which says something about their view of Christianity. But in any case, it was an incentive to become Christian, among other things. And so gun control fails. The Iroquois have a lot of weapons and they dominate. Well, they raid for captives and they adopted people. You see this in various Indian, it's not the blood mixture. It's that they needed people to release people. They were losing people by disease. They had low fertility rates, and they lost a lot of people in warfare and hard winters and everything else. They also raided for ceremonial purposes. They needed captives. They sacrificed them, and they tortured them, chopped them up. I mean, it's not a pretty picture. Now, this is in the context in the same time in Europe, in this about same period, 150 year period, the Europeans kill 40,000 witches, hanging them, burning them. They were burning heretics at the stake. One of the punishments was dismembering people limb from limb in the various wars in Europe and the strife. So it's a crueler, more violent world. Okay, so where do we go from here? 1651, a Frenchman, a boy, really, he's between 10 and 15 years old, is in the forefront of the French settlements in French Canada. Quebec has been established, Montreal hasn't, and there's a community in English, Three Rivers, and maybe 50, 60 people, and his older sisters are there, and he is sent to live with them, presumably because he can't be supported in Europe. So he goes hunting with a couple of friends or companions. They get captured by the Mohawks. The other two guys are killed. He has been separated. He fights back, wounds one of the Iroquois, but they are impressed that he's this feisty kid. And so they don't kill him right then. They take him And he shows an immediate interest in Iroquois culture. It turns out this guy is a linguistic genius. And so they don't kill him right away, and they torture him a little bit. But a senior woman, there are often important female leaders, decides she wants to adopt him to replace a son who has been killed, a young warrior. His adoptive father is one of the battle chiefs of the Mohawk, who, from signs on his body, has killed 19 men. These are, again, not happy-go-lucky kind of neighbors. Radisson relates these experiences later in life, and he is an incredible man, not particularly nice in many ways, but he goes on to found the Hudson Bay Company, coming trade furs from the north. But of particular interest here is he escapes with, he's with several Iroquois, and an Algonquin joins them, the traditional enemies, and they're headed back towards the French area, and the Algonquin convinces him to attack the other Iroquois. They kill the other Iroquois and behead them, and the Algonquin wants to take the heads back to show the people. So they do, but they get caught by another group of Mohawks. So the Algonquin gets shot and killed, and Radisson, by the way, that's the hotel name comes from him, because he's viewed as a hero in some ways. What I'm going to tell you, you'll be careful about the buffet in the Radisson hotels in the future if you listen to it. He throws the heads overboard so they won't know that he'd done this, but the heads float. They so they capture him with the three heads. Now, they don't kill him. They think he's spunky. So they take him back, they torture him some more. His mother saves him again. They have a mechanism to pay off people for damages. His family puts up a lot of money anyway. Shortly thereafter, they won't let him be a warrior. He's not ready yet. His father leads a war party to go to the east, but they agree that he can go with 9 or 10 other young men to the west. So he goes on a war party that goes essentially down the south side of Lake Ontario, down the south side of Lake Erie, killing other Indians as they go. And they take some captives, and these Indians there was a tribe called the Erie that the Iroquois wiped out. There was a tribe called the Neutrals, but they exterminated their enemies. So Radisson writes this later. They get over to what would be northeast Indiana, Fort Wayne area, obviously not there, and Indiana wasn't a concept. And they turn south, capturing some people. They're going to take back some captives, including some women who they would use to work, and go down to the falls of the Ohio, and then up the Ohio back to the Allegheny. It's a big loop. But as they come back through Indiana, they get hungry and they don't have time to eat, so they kill the women and eat them. This isn't ceremonial. This is, we need protein, whatever. Anyway, so Radisson, this is one of many, many raids that the Iroquois launched to the west. They drive the Potawatomi, or Michigan, north. They drive the Shawnee south. So they clear out Indiana. If you go north from Crawfordsville and go to Chicago by going over 74, up 63, up to Kentland, more or less, and cut over, there's the Iroquois River. They raided all the way over into Illinois. So at one point, the Algonquin tribes and some of the Iroquois speaking, the remnants of the Hurons, were either forced to join in a subservient position, the Iroquois, or flee, or they were dead. And so a large number of them flee across the top of the Great Lakes to the area of Green Bay, Wisconsin. The Packers weren't there yet, but they wanted to get good seats, so they got there early. Anyway, it is a huge conglomeration of tribes that have been destroyed in many ways. They've had the diseases, but they don't yet have metal weapons. So they get together and they lived in fortified communities, as did so the Iroquois, until they had firearms by and large. So there may be 10,000 of them struggle on, and there's a river system that will take you down from Green Bay with some portages to the Mississippi. So Radisson is there later. He's not there when a raiding party of 800 Iroquois arrived to try and take these people on. Anyway, the gist of this is that the Iroquois lose, they don't have food, and the amalgamated tribes have a fortification and have food. They buy the Iroquois off who are desperate. The Iroquois split up in two groups. One goes back through the northern route back, but they get caught by tribes up there and obliterated except for a few. And the major bulk of the Iroquois descend south out of Wisconsin over into central Illinois, where they eradicate tribes that were related to the Miami, the Illinois Indians, Chief Illinois of Illinois fame. They eradicate them. I mean, that's it. They kill them. But some survivors arrive and trap them and wipe them out. So this is brutal, brutal warfare. So the point of this is by, say, 1690, 1700, there's nobody in Indiana. It's too dangerous. The Iroquois can come down quickly. So the Iroquois side with the French, side with the British, and you have the French and Indian Wars. And in 1760s, the French get defeated. And so they no longer control central Indiana, and people start filtering back down. You had a trading post at Whatnot, you had one at South Bend, and you had maybe 300 people at Vincennes. George Rogers Clark, which we're familiar with, launches what's essentially is a long raid. Now, the point of this Indian culture is it's all raiding, and the Algonquin civil government is often collapsed, and there are military societies which raid back and forth. And so George Rogers Clark is a raid. He goes, takes Kaskaskia, comes back to Vincennes. It's not the idea that they're going to hold the land, but that from then on, you have the American Revolution. Well, let me skip now to the European part about this and try and succinctly summarize what's happening there in 1650. 1650, you have the end of the English Civil War, which is a brutal Civil War, terribly confusing, not taught much about in American schools because it is so confusing, but it has dramatic impacts on the early part of American, the colonies, and the formation of what becomes the United States. Cromwell leads the parliamentary party army, and a couple of years before that, the parliamentary party, as the saying goes, shortened King Charles I's neck, his reign, and the monarchy by executing him. So theoretically, the government is being run by Parliament, but increasingly the army, which is a professional, competent army, disciplined full-time, is ruling the roost. And they win a series of battles. The battle starts in the western part of England, and it ends in the western part of England 10 years later. But the area that is largely fought over are the borderlands. And for 700 years, the French, being the Scottish kings and English kings, fight over this area, and nobody really controls it. So it's run by outlaws and bandits, and they form what we think of as clans. Now, these aren't the Highland tartan guys dancing around over crossed swords. These are more or less like outlaw gangs, but as with the Indians, they form cultural attachments for protection. So some of the names of these people, they're on where Hadrian's Wall was, if you want. Some of them are transported to Ireland as mercenaries to control the Catholics, but that's part of it. But names like Graham, Maxwell, Taylor, Armstrong, I won't get into other club members' names, but these are ruthless raiders. The Maxwells could put 3,000 men out, and they skinned some of their opponents and nailed their hides to the wall as a warning to other people. It was the same terror kind of campaign that the Indians carried on. But just a couple of the cultural context, historian David Hackett Fisher devotes a good deal of a book about these people and how what we see in what are called the Southern Upland South or the Highland Southerners are people culturally related to these people. They were not just Scottish, and they were not from the Highlands, but they were from the lowlands. They lived on isolated farms, many of them. It wasn't some pretty little European village, but they had towers that they built that were for self-defense. And they may be 10 by 10, but you got more money. They had a low door, they're built with stone, and they had an enclosed barnyard. But when you were in danger of being raided, you'd bring the livestock into the first floor, lock the door, bar it. You had a ladder to pull up. You lived in the second and third floor, or second floor if you were poor, third floor if you were richer. You had a roof, you had a beacon that you could light. So the English adage that your home is your castle, it was literally your home was a castle, a mini castle. There were various degrees. And but they were used to forting up, if you were willing, and they would bring in some people around them, and the English expression of raising a hue and a cry comes from the cultural concept that if you were raided, you would sound the alarm, light a beacon, and go chasing the people for your cattle, hogs, horses, your money, your relatives who were being held for ransom. And your neighbors were obligated to join you. And you didn't need any legal authorization for 7 days to do this. And if your neighbors didn't join you, you could assume that they were part of the raiding party. So they would go raiding north or raiding south. And some of these clans, families, were on both sides of the border. They also hired out as mercenaries, and they would switch sides in the middle of the battle. They were very hard to organize. They didn't like outside authorities. They resented strangers. And they lived in the Southern Highlands. They came over and they moved down the mountains. They were trafficked in modern language. People didn't want them. Cromwell didn't want them. He was a law and order kind of guy. So he's stamping out. So they are deported, shipped out. Some of them are prisoners of war. Some of them are criminal prisoners. And they come, and the people on the border of the English colonies don't like these guys. They don't want them. So if you had a trade or something, you may stay, but they get forced to the frontier, and they shift their way southwards. In the Civil War in the United States, to jump way ahead, the Confederacy found out to their great sorrow that they could not count on these people. And in North Carolina, western North Carolina, Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and Tennessee, there was endemic warfare that was borderline warfare like these people had been used to 200 years ago at that point in time. But one of the North Carolina regiments in the Civil War, that's about 1,000 men, they had military conscription, which these people deeply resented. They didn't want to be in anybody's army. 750 of the men deserted out of 1,000. So anyway, back to where we are. These people filter through out to the mountains, cross the mountains, and so these are the people who come up from Kentucky and Tennessee to settle southern Indiana. And my point is you have these two raiding cultures that meet each other, and it's very hard to control the young men who believe that you raid to make a reputation. And so the Indian chiefs couldn't control them, nor were the leaders. And there are a lot of charismatic leaders. What you weren't elected, you weren't appointed, you just gathered up a group of men and you went after it. And the results were that if there was a raid by the Indians, there would be a retaliatory raid that struck the next group of Indians they see. If they were related, fine, or if not. You have all these mixed villages filtering down from the south. So the people who call themselves Miami are not the Miami of 150 years ago. They are now a mixture of various tribes, but they do have some authority and some structure, but they can't control their young men. And so they raid. And you find accounts of a mixed raiding party. And so you may have Indians who are Potawatomis or even Chippewa, or tribes that we don't think of really being here. But so let's say it's now the American Revolutionary War is over. Who are the Indians here? You've got some Potawatomis up in the north, west. You have the various parts of the Miami, the Wea, the Pinkashaw, which you see sometimes named here, that have come back either from the west or from the north. You have Kickapoo, who are probably never here at all, who are like the Fox and the Sioux who've come down. And so some of these, they talk about sharing land and wherever else. They were used to living together for mutual protection. And so in 1790, the British sell out the Indians wholesale in the Revolutionary War and give the Indians land to the U.S. as part of the settlement for the war. The new country needs the land because they haven't had any way to pay the Revolutionary soldiers. So they dole out warrants to the soldiers, who many of them don't come, and you have land speculators. You had land speculators under the colonies. A politician or a political figure would get a block of land. He'd chop it up to wholesalers who would then try and sell it to people. Well, people didn't want to buy land. They didn't know where it was with no improvements. So long story short, the speculators, developers would say to somebody, well, you go settle on this. There's no rent for 10 years. Well, some of the borderland people took that. Some people didn't even bother with that. They just squatted. So that there was a culture that developed that dealt with the more developed parts of the country, and they developed a particular cultural. They didn't wait for the government to make rules, they made them. And for example, one was that if somebody showed up with a regular piece of title for your land, they were required to pay the guy who had cleared it and built a cabin for the improvements. That wasn't a legal requirement, but the local community requirement. Early on in Hendricks County, next to us, there was an outfit called the Boulder Club. And they were people who arrived if your land was being taken away from you where you had been inhabiting. They put boulders there to warn the sheriff that you better not do it. Okay. So 1790, 1791, the U.S. sends two armies north on the Indiana and Ohio border. Within 100 and 150 miles of where we sit, four of the biggest battles between the Indians and the whites took place, and two of them were huge losses for the U.S. And we don't teach a lot of that in school, but in 1790-91, ragtail armies of militia, a lot of Scotch-Irish and these borderers in this, and they get wiped out in successive years by the Indians. Hundreds of dead and retreat in absolute disarray. Washington is absolutely outraged and insists that they reform the army, which is dissolved. The United States essentially had no army by the end of the Revolutionary War. And the British have retained Detroit in contradiction to the treaty that they've signed. So Mad Anthony Wayne sets up a professional army in Pittsburgh, trains it, and they move north out of Cincinnati again in 1792-3 and end up defeating the Indians in a battle of Fallen Timber, where they crush an Indian confederation. The armies that crushed the Indians were confederations managed by various tribal leaders. They were magnificent, but some of those tribal leaders said, we can't win, we need to negotiate. Well, the Indians are crushed, and so that dissipates this threat. The British lock the gates of the fleeing Indians and won't let them in. So they're in great disarray. 1802, William Henry Harrison's made governor of the Indiana Territory, and it gets its name because it's the remnant of the whole big Northwest Territory, which was called Indiana, and everybody else picks an Indian name, so we get stuck with what's called Indiana. So Harrison is charged with buying up Indian land from these people who are relatively recent inheritance. An Indian leader named Tecumseh arises, and he won't deal with the Harrison and resents it. And it leads an Indian consciousness movement, to use a modern term, tries to convince the Indians, we're all Indians together. Nobody can sell the land, and we'll hold the line here. He has a brother who becomes a religious leader called the prophet Tenskwatawa, who is a little hard to figure out, but he said only way we can do this is we get rid of everything from the white man. This means kettles, arms, hose, every alcohol, which is a huge problem. We need to be entirely Indian. Tecumseh doesn't go that far. Well, there is again a polyglot colony, Prophetstown, outside of Lafayette. You're probably all familiar with it. And it again is not this tribe or that tribe. It's an amalgamation of these people who got together in Green Bay a long time ago now and are used to being together with some Northern allies. Harrison wants to make a preemptive strike. So he leads a group of seasoned militia, again, borderers, a great many of them, with a few regular troops north, camps at what is the Tippecanoe battleground now. Tenskwatawa convinces the military leaders they need to strike first. They do in a very close battle where there are only 500 of them against 1,000. They almost win. If they would have killed Harrison early in the battle, they might have done. Well, they lose. And it essentially crushes the Indian consciousness movement. So it's hard for people to understand here in Indiana, but this is where the last best chance of the Indians to have a united front against the Americans collapses. Tecumseh goes and eventually joins, still hopes with the British. He's a well recognized, admired man by almost anybody who meets him. And he goes, and in one of the battles in Canada in the later part of the War of 1812, he dies. And with it, the Indian consciousness movement dies. Well, okay, so what do we conclude out of this about refugees? It's a long way around. We've dealt with two groups of refugees. If you think, you just take the Afghans, and again, none of this is anti-Afghan, but I think it points out a couple of things. There's a push and a pull about when you leave one culture or country and go to another. You're an E immigrant, you become an I immigrant. If there's a huge amount of push, we think you're a refugee. You've been driven out. There's no place for you. Both the borderlands and the Indians, there wasn't a place for them anymore for various reasons. So when we talk about our Afghan allies, the Afghans, like the Indians in particular, but so like the borderland, are greatly varied among themselves. In the case of Afghanistan, they speak different languages, different religious parts of Islam. Some are not Islamic. So you're going to be dealing with very, very different people. And some of them needed a port in the storm. They may be here temporarily, they think, and they're going to do something else. It isn't that they've said, we're all in America. And again, this is not opposed to them, but every immigrant group after the Second World War, in my lifetime, I dealt with Hungarian refugees from 1956 who were being integrated into the U.S. Army. And one of the guys we were doing a clearance on had been in 4 previous armies and now was swearing undying loyalty to the United States. He had reason to believe that may or may not happen. But so you're dealing with people who are very, very different. Secondly, the adjustment, or thirdly, the adjustments, even if they want to be here, will be very, very different. What happened with the Indians is the traditional peaceful leaders lost all authority. So they had these young men they couldn't control. Authorities were saying, well, we're going to make a deal with you. But they were saying, well, we'll sign, but we can't control everybody. But I've, in my own personal experience, and by the way, not everybody who is a refugee is because of a political system. In my own extended family, men who were young men, father remarried, and the new wife said, adios, we don't want you around. So in the case of Sweden and in England, they felt forced out. Now, there weren't terror, whatever else, but there was no longer a place. But let's suppose you come here and you're a 50-year-old man and maybe you were in the military, whatever it was. You get here and you're dependent upon your 10-year-old daughter to interact with the authorities for you. It's just shattering in many ways. It's just hard to figure out. Women often make the adjustment better. there used to be things called settlement houses in urban areas in Chicago, Hull House, that took immigrant women and taught them about American ways. Well, in one sense, the men have a lot more to give up. And a third element, a fourth element in this, and then I really will quit, is that the principal adjustment difficulty is the same young men, if they came from a warrior culture or raiding culture, who said, well, you're here now, put away the weapons, we'll get you a good job, we're gonna get you some new clothes, teach you 2 months of language, and get you a nice job in a factory. How'd you like that? It's like saying to Indian warriors, how'd you like to farm? Well, the women farm. That's not what I do. And the universal experience in Europe, universal, is that their problem with terrorists has not been people who infiltrated from the various areas, their former colonies or whatever else, and came to Europe. It is a successive generation of young men who never figured out a way to fit in and were alienated and became terrorists or alienated while they were in the country and could not find a place for themselves in the country. So there, well, and let me finish with this, with another story. I hope I've encouraged you to think a little bit differently about Hoosiers, but in the late 1950s, there was a cheer at Indiana University, and it seemed that the cheerleaders were always from Southern Indiana. So this was always drawn out in Southern, rip them up, tear them up, give them hell, Hoosiers. Well, that was pretty racy for the 1950s, and the administration would try and stamp that out, and you had the vision of the cheerleaders trying to calm the crowd. Now at Indiana, this was somewhat mitigated by the fact is we would try that on the Ohio State crowd after they had ripped off 3 20-yard gains in a row, and we obviously were not terrorizing them. But the picture of David Hackett Fisher of Hoosiers being poor but proud, we have that culture that's still with us, except we did away with that chair, unfortunately. Well, that's it.
In Wabash, we had the blood cheer. Blood makes the grass grow greener, greener.
Well, that may be part of the borderers too. Yeah, it was a little violent for the time. There were other ones that weren't quite as appropriate either, but applied to DePaul. Well, so you have the benefit of 2 years of isolation, and my family thanks you.
What do you think the reason behind? I've just never been able to understand why all these entities want to change their name away from an Indian name as far as their mascots. To me, a mascot is held in esteem. I mean, you're proud of that, and I don't understand why they, just say the Cleveland Indians. I don't know. They haven't changed yet, I don't think. But what's so bad? Maybe I don't understand what's so bad about that, because you wouldn't name something after something you didn't like, would you?
Let me give you a partial maybe explanation for that. Is that the use of it by one person is not what's the impression of somebody else. And my great-great-great-grandfather's brother married a Choctaw woman, and more or less my family got deported from England in the first place. This guy marries a Choctaw and gets deported by Andrew Jackson to Arkansas. It's a family tradition that people don't want us. Anyway, his name was John. And what's absolutely fascinating is that much later in life, my great-grandfather has a much younger brother named John. Now, this is after this guy has married a Choctaw and is long gone. And so the attitude towards Indianness was greatly varied. Why are all these cities, 3 or 4 of the counties in Indiana are Miami, the Delaware, Elkhart is an Indian name, are named after Indian things. But when I went to a family reunion of these distant relatives, they were all Indians, about 100 of various degrees, maybe some had mangled it, but one of them, the chief historian, not the chief in the Indian way, was still upset about the loss of some land in Alabama and they say 1820. But what I think they resent, like the Redskins, the Washington Redskins, is that's not an entirely positive name. And so some of the Indians say, well, you've appropriated this use of us as an image that we don't entirely like the image. Now, it's fascinating that I think, to your point, which is right, that a lot of the opposition to the use of those things like the warrior or the tomahawk chop motion, it does not come from Indians, and I'm not excusing any of it or saying the Indians don't care. But in the case of these people at Oklahoma, there was a Coach Pebworth of one of the high schools that was an Indian team. They were the Warriors, and they were not. But words like squaw are not entirely positive. So that when they get upset, it's one, that this has been appropriated. And by the way, trying to figure out what Indians were where and who, and taking their genetic remains faces often fierce opposition because they've got a lot entailed in. And often, by the way, when they form clans and things, and the same with the people in the borders, they developed a myth about how we were related. So that's not really an answer, but it's not often the Indians, it's people who think that they are representing the Indians and are saying this part of it would be offensive. We can think of ethnic titles that we would appreciate. By the way, in my discussion of the people in the borderlands, I don't mix them up with hillbillies. That's a much later contribution. And for example, the Hatfield and McCoy feud, that the border people feuded fiercely, and that was part of their culture. But I don't think some of us would feel very happy if it was the Wabash Hillbillies. You know, and by the way, the names that are ascribed to DePaul by Wabash students are not necessarily ethnically negative, but there are some others that have negative, and so that may be it's the thought that goes into it. And of course, the Redskins, other than they have a despicable owner who can't wait to get into trouble of any kind, you know, and say part of the Redskins problem too is that they ran a racist organization for years and refused to sign blacks, and the owners had to beg them to finally allow blacks on his roster many, many years ago. So it rapidly gets wrapped up into a lot of other things. You asked for what time it was. I told you how to make a clock, but that strikes me as the...
You're just not woke enough, Andy.
What's that?
You're just not woke enough.
I'm not woke enough.
Yeah, right.
Well, let me another sort of, when we moved, I grew up in the south side of Chicago. This is probably 1973, 74, something like that. My children are till junior high, and one of them twins. They come home, and we usually get our daughter talking and trying to find out what's happening with our son. So you had co-equal, well, you didn't get much out of our son. Anyway, he used an ethnic epithet from about somebody, and that particular group didn't exist here. And I was first said, well, you know, our family, we don't do that kind of thing, you know, and understand the deeper roots. But the other thing I realized, I literally broke out in a cold sweat. Well, if you were from Chicago, you didn't use an ethnic epithet. You wanted to be offensive. And to call somebody a ethnic, or make a comment about a girl from a particular ethnic group, you were literally asking for trouble. So the connotation that using a particular phrase is often was originally designed to be hurtful or harmful. And when we start talking about what happens in school, I got the concept of wokeness and political correctness and all that sort of stuff. But I think most of us, that when push comes to shove, don't want to say things that are demeaning and hurtful. And one of the other things, by the way, I ran into this too. A group might use a term among themselves I won't get into black folks, that they may use, but it is not a good idea in my opinion, but it's entirely inappropriate for somebody else to use that term. I ran a summer program in college and had a counselor work for me who was Arab American. And he essentially referred to himself as a towel head, the Arab American. And he did it. There was a sort of news broadcast we did. And I said, you can't do that. That may seem funny to you. And maybe he said, well, my friends and I, well, he was very Americanized, but his parents had made an epic struggle to leave Lebanon. I said, you can't do that. And I said, it'll be misunderstood. You don't want somebody to think that that's appropriate and outside your group. So he did it again. I finally had said, that's it, Greg. You do that one more time, I have to fire you. I can't have that happen. And he grudgingly admitted that, but he said, but it's a sort of internal joke. I said, well, it may not be a joke within everybody in your group, but you know, there comes to mind, there was, we talked about movies earlier, the movie Slapshot, which was the comedy, and it's a hockey team, and who is it? It's about all these roughnecks, but there's an Indian, and this guy is silent and big and tough, and the team nickname is Chief. Anyway, it's an old style of humor. One other tidbit of Wabash, and by the way, I originally had Wabash in this. Another huge cultural adjustment were the men that founded Wabash College came from New England, and they were sent out here to civilize the crackers and rednecks and the Hoosiers by and large. And there was a lot of cultural clash between these people from their east. There was a baseball player who went to Wabash. Kickapoo Ed was his nickname. I forget his last name, from Ladoga. And he holds a major league record that has never been broken. He was a very young pitcher on the Detroit team with Ty Cobb. And he won 20 games in his rookie year in the major leagues. The only guy who's ever done that. And he apparently was ambidextrous, pitched with both hands, and threw all sorts of junk pitches, spitters, but had a knuckleball. And he lasted a couple of years, and then his arm, or I don't know which arm, was hurt, and he faded out of it. But he was always referred to as Kickapoo Ed from Ladoga. And somebody wondered, well, how many of the Kickapoo were in Ladoga? Well, he had no connection at all to the Kickapoo, but there was another baseball player, Chief Bender. Or there was also the famous Wabash football coach, Francis Caillou, who in the early 1900s was an Indian who'd gone to the Indian school. And that would have been an adventurous hire, to hire an Indian as a coach in those days, because there were good Indians and bad Indians. Good Indians were far away, was the sort of adage. Well, I held forth for a long time.
I just Googled Kickapoo Ed.
Yeah.
His name was Ed Summers. He went from Ladoga and he went to Wabash and he died in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Huh. There was also a guy down there by the name of Three Fingers Brown.
Yeah.
He was from
That's walking the handicap, Andy. Watch yourself.
well, he was from Liesville, Indiana. We went to his there's a monument down there not too far from Rockville. It's kind of neat. He got his fingers cut off in a farming accident, and he was a pitcher, and the way he held the ball, it made him a great pitcher.
Well, he was a very good pitcher for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, Jerry, I think you should.
Niceville. I said Liesville. It's Niceville.
Yeah. Well, one other weird thing. Most names we take from the Indians, somebody said, well, what does Chicago really mean? Get this scenario. The name that we have for something in English often comes from a Frenchman or a French Canadian who's intermarried, saying to an Indian, what do they call this, referring to another tribe? So Indian A said, well, Indian B says Indian C's tribe calls this Shawaba, or wherever else. So that gets transliterated through two Indian languages to a French Canadian to an Englishman. So by the time we get to Chicago or Sheboygan or, name, who knows? But how many of you have ever heard of Rushville, Indiana? You know where it is?
Yeah.
Andy? It's outside of Lafayette. You know the derivative of that, how that name came about? It's spelled Russiaville, Russiaville. I had Russia students saying, oh, I didn't know there were Russians there. I said, I don't think so. Probably about the same number that were like Ladoga. Ladoga, Indiana was a Russian name. Nobody knows. Well, Rushville is spelled Russiaville, pronounced Rushville, and it is from a French Canadian named Rousseau, Rossseau, who was half Indian. And he stayed and settled there. So it was Rousseauville. But the southern whites coming up can't say Rousseauville. So it became Rushville. But they didn't have to spell it, but they couldn't spell Rousseau. So they spelled it Russia. Russia would be Russia in Southern dialect. One other Southern tidbit of these folks. The double diminutive for first names, Billy Joe, Freddie Sam. This is another borderland thing from England, but it happens because they all had the same last name and you had 3 Williams. So you had to determine which William you were talking to. So if it was Willie James, it would be Willie Jim or whatever else. Our son came home from John Beard School. He was in 3rd or 4th grade, really irritated. He said, I'm the only kid in class that has only one name. I'm Carl. Everybody else is Billy Joe, Freddie Jim. Why don't I have 2 names? Well, he's named after a maternal Swedish grandfather, great grandfather for him. And his middle name's Robert. So we said, okay, we'll call you Carly Bob if you like that, So that was the inside joke. So years later, he's at a big Indianapolis law firm. It was Baker and Daniels in those days. And you would go visit him. And the receptionist was this crusty Scottish war bride. I mean, she was 80 years old if she was a day. And she had married a Wabash graduate. So she knew me, and I'd go over to see Carl for lunch or something. So big, grandiose office space. She'd announce, Carl Pebworth, you have a visitor. Well, if he didn't respond, or any of them didn't respond, she would get a little more urgent and irritated. So it's Carl Pebworth, you have a visitor. Carl Pebworth, you have a visitor. And she'd break into this guy's group. Finally, it was, Carly Bob, your daddy's here. He came down to say, well, fortunately, nobody knew who Carly Bob was. So that's it.
Well, on that note, we'll probably end it. Interesting talk. Thanks for the history lesson. And next week, what's on the schedule is Marge Crouch. She's a Riley volunteer and has a lot to do with the whole comfort cart thing.
Gary, one last story for you. I can't resist is that many of you watch what's now called the Magnolia Channel. It used to be the do-it-yourself channel, and the couple from Texas, the rehab homes, have any of you seen? And what, I forget what their name is, but when I first saw her, she looked like an American Indian, but it turns out she's Korean,
right,
up in Texas, and she mentions that. I was on the Wabash campus, and a couple of Chinese students were asking me about Indians, and I was trying to say, well, they're long gone. We might have a few students that are incidentally Indian, but they're not from around here. And there were a couple over the years. Anyway, when these guys came in excited and said, we've just seen an Indian on the campus. I said, oh, who was it? And they said, well, look, he's right outside here. I said, he's Korean. He's not an Indian. And, there are similarities facially and everything else. And some Chinese students once at a bus station in New York, in Minnesota, told me that they thought they saw another Chinese guy and went and tried to talk to him, and they thought he was just wouldn't talk to him in Chinese. And they finally said to him in English, we're in China, they meant. And the guy was saying, "Are you guys nuts?" He said, "I'm from the Indian reservation about 25 miles from here." And the Chinese response to me was, after years of being here, they looked at me and they said, "Maybe we all do look alike." There you go. If that doesn't get us in trouble, we can. Okay,
All right.
thank you.
So keep an eye out for an email from Gary with the link to next week's meeting. With any amount of luck, we'll be able to meet face to face on the 24th. So keep an eye on your inbox, and y'all have a good week, okay?
Okay,
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Robin.
Thank you, Robin. Did a good job.
You can blame Andy for any of this because he got me on.